Hey everyone, it is week 4, and we're going to dive into a period of European history that is referred to as the Baroque period. As you can see here, you need to have read chapter 15 of our textbook, A History of Western Society. Let's dive right into this. So what is the Baroque era? Well, its beginning and ending dates are a little mushy. As you can see here, it says that it begins circa 1600, but you may also notice that kind of overlaps the tail end of what we consider to be the Renaissance in Europe, and that it ends around 1750, but you're going to notice a little bit later on that kind of overlaps a period of time that we refer to as the Rococo. So it's wibbly wobbly where it sort of fits in, but we can, at least for the most part, fairly safely say that the 17th century in Europe comprises the Baroque era. The term Baroque comes from a Portuguese word, barroca, which means a pearl of irregular shape. It roughly translates to a pearl of irregular shape, and that's because it denotes a sense of strangeness, irregularity, and extravagance, which are all qualities that we're going to see on display in the Baroque. The Baroque era sort of sets itself up as the antithesis, as you will, of all the kind of orderliness of the high into the late Renaissance. There's going to be much more of a focus on opulence and the emotional side of human nature. But that's not to suggest that there were no scientists during this era. There's going to be some really interesting things that are going to happen in science. And it's going to be that sort of direct confrontation between science and religion that also contributes to the irregularity, strangeness, extravagance, if you will, of this era. In 1610, we have Galileo Galilei, who is going to confirm Copernicus's heliocentric model of the universe. In 1687, you have Sir Isaac Newton in Britain, who publishes his laws of universal gravitation in opposition to the Protestant Reformation that we've been talking about in the last couple of lectures. The Catholic Church launches the Counter-Reformation. Now, this is a sort of two-pronged approach that the Catholic Church sort of launches into from about somewhere around 1543 to about 1648, where there's this real push for a Catholic revival. As I mentioned before, it's the response of the Catholic Church to the Protestant Reformation. And as I was just trying to say, it was a two-pronged approach. It was designed to attract people back to the church and to punish heretics. So you have on one end of it a real push to try to make some internal reforms within the church and to present themselves as the kinder, gentler church of the people, to sort of try to attract people back to the church who have been tempted away by the Reformation that was happening at the time. Right? So you have that on one end, and on the other end, you have punishment. Right? You have the Catholic Church, who the lesson that they seem to have learned from Martin Luther and Calvin and others like them is that we let that Martin Luther guy go too long, right? We were too easy on him. We took our time with him. We tried to reason with him. We let him go too long, and look what happened. He created all this. So in order to try to make sure that another Martin Luther doesn't come along and create a schism in the church or pull people away from the church, and the task of seeking out and punishing heretics was given over to the Roman and Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
But yeah, the Spanish and Roman Inquisitions, these were two governing bodies that were established by the church who were set up specifically to seek out people who were either, in the church's mind, putting out heretical ideology, who might be saying things that are scientific, or that might in some way be spreading philosophies or ideas that could create another Martin Luther. So it was a very fraught time to be interested in anything that was of a secular nature. Because if you voiced an interest in studying things that were scientific, or if you voiced some opinions or ideas that weren't perfectly in line with Catholic dogma, or if you had the gall to suggest that something that you learned came from some sort of authority other than the Catholic Church, you could find yourself in a lot of trouble. You could find yourself being put on trial by the Spanish or Roman Inquisitions, where you would be accused of heresy, maybe even witchcraft, things of that nature. And there were various punishments that could come out of a guilty verdict. You could be, like Martin Luther was, excommunicated from the church. And as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, right, if you're excommunicated from the church, you're no longer a member of the church, you have ergo lost your salvation. You can't go to heaven. So that was a real threat for a lot of people living in this era. Or you could be put to death. Let's say your ideas and your ideology, the things you were saying, were considered such a threat to the church that they did not want you to be able to leave the church and pull people away from you. There was the punishment of death, often by being burned at the stake, things of that nature. You could be imprisoned as well, indefinitely. Now, as I said, there was also the flip side of that. There was the welcoming back into the fold. There was this, and how genuine this was on the part of the Catholic Church is debatable. But what they were saying was, hey, people, think about everything that Protestant Reformation is about, right? They are all about working out your own salvation, that salvation is attainable without the help of priests and saints, and that you should seek out and read for yourself in order to gain the knowledge that you need to work out your own salvation. So get that Bible, read it, read other things that people have written, right? So that you understand and know what's actually in that thing. And the Catholic Church says, well, what about the vast majority of Europeans who are illiterate? Don't they deserve salvation too? And besides that, look, you're not just a brain, right? You are a human being with blood, sweat, and tears and emotions. And we care about that too. We're not just about the brain. And again, if the Reformation is all about reading and working out your own salvation, the Catholic Church would say, that sounds like a lot of the pressure is being put on you and you alone. Whereas in the Catholic Church, we're all about helping you attain that salvation that is way too difficult of a task for you to do alone. We are interested in you, the human being that you are, not this intellectual soul, right? That can speak large words and what have you. We're interested in the people. Come on back. We love you. God loves you. That kind of thing. Right? And again, how genuine that was is questionable, but it was the other half of this two-pronged approach. So additionally, as we talk about the Baroque era, what was going on and what contributes to a lot of the things that happen, there was, at the time, climate change. It wasn't human-created climate change, but it was climate change nonetheless. Scientists looking back at it say that we sort of went through what's called a mini ice age in the northern hemisphere around this time. And as a result, there were food shortages and shrinking populations in Europe. And this made a lot of emotions bubble to the forefront, as well as there were these religious conflicts happening on the European continent that didn't end once the Renaissance came to an end. Those conflicts continued and they escalated. There was what was referred to as the 30 Years' War, literally because it was 30 years. It went from about 1618 to 1648. That happened when the truce of the Peace of Augsburg that we talked about in either the last lecture or the one before, deteriorated, and Europe began to sort of form into different factions. There was a group known as the Protestant Union, representing the Protestants throughout Europe, and a group known as the Catholic League, representing all of the Catholics of the European continent. And the 30 Years' War began as a war that was just specifically between these two groups, but it eventually spread to include nearly every single European nation on the continent. This war was over ideology. And countries suddenly found themselves as having to sort of align themselves with the Catholic Church, or align themselves with some sort of Protestant group or Protestant sect, and literally fight each other to the death. And again, some of that religious frustration might have also been reflecting the kinds of frustrations that could come from food shortages and shrinking populations as people die from starvation, but also disease. And there are those who feel like that may have also fueled a lot of this animosity. National borders start to be redrawn as these wars are happening, and borders start getting pushed around. And honestly, this is the period of time where a lot of Europe starts to look the way it looks even now today. Certain areas, of course, the borders are forever shifting and changing, but a lot of countries got their pretty firm borders during this time. During this time, you have Spain that had been this huge political and economic power in Europe and in conquering the New World. Spain's power starts to decline a bit during this time, and then, interestingly enough, France and Holland begin to rise in power. France, who also begins conquering in the New World and gaining a foothold there, and Holland, which also did a little bit of conquering, just not quite as much in the New World, you'll recall is a country at this time that is very commercially minded, right? Not nearly as hung up on religion as some of the other nations around Europe. The Baroque era is also often referred to as the Age of Crisis because there's this particular question that starts to rise up. We're going to look at two types of ideology, absolutism versus constitutionalism. As state power is growing in Europe, because more and more countries no longer feel like they owe their fidelity to the church and can break away from those church alliances. Many of them stop being so much kingdoms or sort of small city-states and become actual nations. And that those nations then start building up large militaries. These large militaries are formed and get involved in that 30 Years' War that we talked about, as well as also defending those newly set borders, and again getting sent over to the New World for conquest. But this then raises a couple of new questions. If now no longer is it the church who gets to tell us who is in power, the first question arises: who should hold supreme power? Who is it that should hold supreme power? Right now that it's no longer a king set in place by God and his emissary, the Pope, right? And that raises the second question of how is that legitimacy of power decided? Because again, we no longer just have the simplicity of God, through his emissary, the Pope here on earth, saying, you have power. God has chosen you. You rule over this particular area. You over here, you rule over that particular area, right? Since that's no longer the case, since God is no longer the one making these decisions, how do we make that decision? How do you decide who a legitimate ruler is? And so a couple of new answers to that question come up. The first one being absolutism. Absolutism is a philosophical idea that says that when it comes to governing, there should be unlimited centralized authority in the government, such as the absolute sovereignty of a monarch or a dictator. Now, it can be argued, like, has there ever been a pure absolutist government yet? And so far, arguments can be made, but so far it seems like just about every government at least has some kind of limitations on the authority. But the idea of absolutism is that there should be an authority figure that governs, and that authority figure is given unlimited authority, unlimited power over the constituency. The thought process being that would streamline things, right? You only have one person who's having to make the decisions, right? It doesn't have to be discussed by lots and lots of committees and things of that nature. And during this time, you have France, Prussia, and Austria who adopt this model. Next, the next answer to this question that comes during the Baroque era is the idea of constitutionalism. Constitutionalism, again, as a political philosophy, says that there should be limitations set on government by law. It should be built into the law of a nation that puts a balancing act that balances the power of the government, because we do need someone to rule, right? And to put things in place, and we need somebody to be in charge. But there should be a balancing act between the power of that ruling body and the rights of the citizens, so that we make sure that the law puts in place a means of keeping that government that's been placed in power from violating those rights. Right? Whereas in an absolutist type of government, the top highest authority is by no means obliged to take into consideration the rights of the people who are ruled. We have, during this time, the Dutch Republic, or Holland. Again, you'll recall Holland is very much a commercial and is becoming very both Protestant and secular during this time. They have a republic, which was a constitutional government, and England. And you would say, wait a minute, England has the royal family. They've got a king and or a queen to this day, right? Well, but during this time, England actually becomes, Great Britain as a whole actually becomes a constitutional monarchy. So that there are still ruling bodies that answer to the people, and there's a set of rights assigned to the people who are governed. And there are certain restrictions placed on exactly what the king and queen are allowed to do. And that had not existed before this time. So Galileo Galilei, talking about the conflicts of science and religion at this time. Galileo Galilei is an Italian scientist who did a lot of incredible things in his time. He developed a very early and crude thermometer. He made some improvements to the telescope. The telescope had been invented before him, but he made some improvements to it that allowed him to get greater magnification and allowed him to start studying heavenly bodies, the planets, the stars, the sun, what have you. He started looking at He discovered that there were moons revolving around Jupiter. No one had really known that was the case before. He started studying moon craters because, again, you just look at the moon with the naked eye, you don't necessarily see that there are all those little craters in there, but get some good magnification on it, and you can start seeing that there are craters and the shadows that it casts as a result. He's discovering those. He also had a filter that he could put onto his telescope that allowed him to point it directly at the sun, and he studied the sunspots. That's what you see sort of represented in this GIF that's been made by animating several of his drawings of the sunspots sort of moving around the surface of the sun. He was studying those things. One of his favorite observations of mine, it's a favorite of mine at least, is he points his telescope toward Saturn. And though the telescope he's working with has better magnification than anything that had come before it at that time, he did not have the benefit of the types of magnification that we have now. And so when he points his telescope at Saturn, he sees something like this, right? And there's a little note in his notebooks that I love where he kind of surmises like, I don't know, I mean, does Saturn have ears? or maybe it has cup handles. He's like, like maybe Saturn is like this thing in the middle and there's like a cup handle on this side and a cup handle on this side, because he can't make sense of this, right? This is what he's seeing. He's just sort of seeing a big blob in the middle with a couple of blobs on either side. But interestingly, he wasn't curious enough to keep on exploring it. He kind of has that note and then he kind of moves on. But it's one of my favorites of his. And like I mentioned before, he confirmed the heliocentric model of the solar system that Copernicus had developed before him. He confirmed it with his observations. And here's where he made his mistake. He's living during the time of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and he's in Italy, so he has to think about and deal with the Roman Inquisition. And he decided to publish his findings in a book that was widely read, where he explained that the only way that all these observations of how the heavenly bodies move is not that the Earth is in the middle, the geocentric model, but that the sun is in the middle and that all of these planets are moving around it. And the sun is the thing that stays still. Again, he didn't have any way to know like we do now that the sun is actually moving too, and like all the planets are just kind of chasing the sun around. But his science was still sound nonetheless. Because he published these findings, he got into a lot of trouble with the Counter-Reformation and was put on trial by the Roman Inquisition and was forced to recant. Now, I should have mentioned that when I was talking about the possible punishments. That's another punishment, is that you may be forced to recant. To recant means to say, these things that I was claiming were wrong. I was wrong. What the Catholic Church says is the truth, is the actual church. I mean, is the actual truth. And to be forced to do that, right? To be forced to claim that you no longer believe this thing that you may find is very integral to who you are as a person was a painful, painful punishment. Galileo seems to have valued his life because he would have been put to death otherwise, and so he chose to recant. But all of his observations were already out there. Another important scientist, as we mentioned earlier, was Isaac Newton. Now, both Isaac Newton and Galileo Galilei are emblematic of a new thing that's happening around this time, and it's the early beginnings of what is going to become the scientific method. As scientists are starting to say, look, we have lots of questions about how the universe operates, how the earth works, how all of this is put together. And we want answers to those questions because we're no longer just satisfied with the answer because God, right? Like, even if that's the truth, even if there is a God who created it all and put it all in motion, how? How does it all work? Why can't we explore those kinds of things? But also, they need to establish, like, how. How do we study these things? And what they arrive at is math. That math seems to be the thing that orders the universe. We can find math contained within everything. And, as I just mentioned, a scientific method. That's the method where you have a question and you come up with a hypothesis that you think could answer that question. I think that this is the reason why X happens. And you set up an experiment that, if the experiment is done in the correct way, it's either going to prove or disprove your hypothesis. You perform the experiment, you get the results back. You look at those results and evaluate whether or not they prove what you have hypothesized, or disprove it, or do the results tell us something about the efficacy of the test, and maybe the test needs to be changed? And then, using those results, you see if you can replicate the results. And eventually, as you replicate the results enough, that hypothesis becomes a theory. That theory then can be tested, right? And so on. And getting other scientists to come in and evaluate the work. The scientific method, that's something that arrives on the scene. And one person in particular who practices it is Isaac Newton, who was a British mathematician, physicist, astronomer, and, interestingly, a theologian. He genuinely believed that there was a God. He's living in England, where there are sort of three factions that are sort of fighting on the religious end. There's the Anglican Church, there's the Catholic Church, and there are like the newly emerging Puritans, right? That are all arguing over the nature of God. And Isaac Newton says, look, if there's a God, and he firmly believed that there was, that God, in creating this universe, must have put his fingerprints on it. And he would have wanted us human beings, intelligent creatures that we are, to find those fingerprints and figure out how it all works. But I particularly want to talk about Isaac Newton's Annus Mirabilis, or his Year of Wonders. I like bringing this up as we ourselves have been living in a pandemic. This Year of Wonders, as it's referred to, was 1666, during what has been called the Plague of London. Now, the Plague of London may sound like it only happened in London, but it spread. It spread outward throughout the English island. And this plague was certainly not a pandemic. It didn't reach all around the globe, but it was an epidemic. And so Isaac Newton, who was in college at the time, suddenly found himself in quarantine as Trinity College sent the students home to quarantine at home. Sound familiar? Sound like something that you may have dealt with yourself in the last couple of years? What we're dealing with right now feels very new, feels very scary. It's happened before, repeatedly. So I kind of want to look at Isaac Newton, because that Year of Wonders, his Year of Wonders as it's referred to, happens in 1666 during his quarantine. During his quarantine, he decides to use his time, because understand, right? It's the 1600s. There's no internet. There's no distance learning. There's no Zoom for learning at home while your teacher teaches you through a screen on your computer. None of that exists. So students who are in quarantine, if they do any learning at all, are having to teach themselves. So Isaac Newton grabs as many books out of the library before he goes home as he can, and he does these investigations and makes lots of discoveries during his year in quarantine that then will sort of affect the rest of his career. It's during this time that he discovers, quote unquote, the fundamental theory of calculus with help. He had a German mathematician whose name I've forgotten now, who he was writing letters back and forth with during this year, and the two of them they developed it together. Newton gets a lot of the credit for it, however. He made certain discoveries when it comes to color and light and the visual spectrum. You can see him here taking a beam of white light and dividing it up into the colors of the spectrum. He also studied gravity during this time, though the whole story of the apple hitting him on the head while he's sitting under the apple tree comes from this particular time. And that these ideas that he has about gravity during this time, the discoveries he makes by setting up experiments and experimenting to sort of understand how gravity works, how motion works, how the velocity of gravity works and all that. These are early steps toward what would later develop as the laws of universal gravitation and his laws of motion. Things like an object at rest tends to stay at rest unless acted upon by another force, and an object in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted upon by another force. Those kinds of things, right? So it's early physics that a lot of the stuff that he discovered is still with us today. We still understand a lot of his discoveries as the basis of physics today. And he did all that while in quarantine. We've been in his shoes. He was sent home from quarantine. He wanted to do more than just sit around the house, so he found ways of getting his mind stimulated, his body stimulated, what have you. But again, this clash, if you will, between science and religion is emblematic of the ideology, the themes that come out during the Baroque, where again there is this focus in both philosophies and, as we've already been talking about, in religions and even in the art and even in the architecture of the time on the opulent. So we look at something like this painting right here, the glorification of Saint Ignatius by Fra Andrea Pozzo, that is very late in the Baroque era, right? Where we have a ceiling. This is a ceiling of a particular room in this palace that has been made to look absolutely luscious and, again, opulent. It reflects excess, right? Not necessarily that orderliness of the high Renaissance, right? The ceiling has been painted in such a way as to appear that there's no ceiling even there, right? That we look up and the ceiling has been extended even beyond the boundaries of it in physical nature, and that we're seeing like the heavens and angels and mythological beings and just all the stuff reaching on into forever, and it's extravagant. And that approach can be seen in the architecture of the time as well. This is San Carlo. This is a church, San Carlo, designed by Francesco Borromini. And the architects, even at this time, are not happy with their buildings just being squares and rectangles, right? Instead, as you can see with this building here, it's curves, it's extravagant sloping and swooping and even swelling buildings, right? On the inside, all these curves and ovals, and even on the front facade of the building that we can see here on the right, it's not flat; it undulates, and right. This is that kind of extravagant opulence that understand. To do that right there, to make a building without corners, he didn't want corners at all in his buildings. That's not easy to do. And so to choose to do something like this is unnecessary, right? It's not just the bare bones necessity in order to make a building. The swelling, circular, rounded corners, well, not even having corners, are not purely functional. And the Catholic Church itself, we can end up seeing a lot of Baroque influence happening there. In fact, as we're going to see as we get into this later on, the Catholic Church, as it's going through the Counter-Reformation, sees the artists of the Baroque period and their insistence upon the extravagant, if you will, as being just what they need to sort of attract people back to the church. And so this is as it mentions down here, the colonnades of St. Peter's. We're talking specifically about the colonnades. It's these two long series of columns that sort of come outward from the Basilica of St. Peter's. This colonnade, as you can see here, was designed by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. He was mostly a sculptor, but he also did some architecture. And he was, again, one of the darlings of the Catholic Church. They saw him and his artwork as being the thing to really attract people back to the church. And so he was their boy. Right? So Gian Lorenzo Bernini comes along, and they approached him specifically to design this colonnade that you see. The church back there, however, was also a new construction. Bernini didn't do that. The original old St. Peter's Basilica, which was still standing once we got to the 1600s, was still that original old ancient Roman basilica that, as you can see here, was built between 319 and 333. So it was a good 1,300-year-old building by this time. St. Peter's Basilica, if you don't know, is the center of the Catholic Church. It is the center. It is in Vatican City, which is a small, like tiny little additional city within the city of Rome. It is traditionally believed to have been built over the burial place of St. Peter, the disciple that is believed to have founded the Catholic Church. And by, again, the 1600s, as the church is going through the Counter-Reformation, they decide they need a facelift. That facelift came from the redesign of the church itself, which you see back there, but then this colonnade, right, that comes out into the area that welcomes the people in. And so it was designed again by Bernini. And look at what he has done with it. You see that Baroque interest with sort of swelling, curving opulence. But it's also addressing what the church wants. Because if you look at this, this is the public area. This is, if anyone wants to approach St. Peter's Church, the symbol of the Catholic Church in and of itself, they walk into this big, large area that is for the people. It is a people's courtyard, if you will. They have to step in here and then move toward the church. And so look at what the columns do. The columns from the building itself sort of come out straight. It's not perfectly straight. They sort of taper inward. And then they swell outward and swing around. Why? What does that do? Well, in a lot of ways, it reaches out and it becomes like a big hug. So that it makes the St. Peter's Basilica there like a mother hen, if you will, the mother church, who is welcoming everybody back with a big hug back into the church. Right? That's the kind of symbol that they wanted. Bernini delivered it for them. So this is again indicative of the Baroque opulence, but also the political and religious machinations that were going on at the time as well. So all this is going on. How did the artists of the time react? Well, you have this new generation of artists that comes along who, at the end of the 16th century and into the 17th century, who began to reject many of the ideas of the High and Late Renaissance. They held on to humanist ideology, but they became much more interested in the emotional qualities of art rather than the cold, what they saw as being the cold, rational approach of those before them. Now, they're holding on to a humanist way of thinking, but they sort of looked at the artists and the period that came before them, the High and Late Renaissance, and say, well, you know what, people got a little too caught up in their brain space. Human beings are more than that. We are also emotional creatures. And if we're going to make art that is about us human beings, why would we ignore that? Why would we excise that from the art? In Italy and Spain, the artists working in this new style were highly sought after by the Catholic Church, as I mentioned a moment ago, who were in the midst of the Catholic Reformation, because they saw that their work could be used to draw the lay people back to the church. Because again, their focus was to get away from the braininess, if you will, of the Reformation and set themselves up as the flip side of that, right? If the Protestant Reformation is going to be all about just attracting people's brains, that's how the Catholic Church would have phrased it, then we're going to be about the people, the blood, sweat, and tears. A little bit later, we'll take a look at how artists in the North reacted to this period of time. So what are the characteristics of Baroque art? How do we know it when we see it? Well, although, like it says here, the Baroque styles were varied widely throughout Europe, there are a few key characteristics that are at least consistent enough that we can mention them here, and they become a way of recognizing whether or not we are seeing something that is Baroque. First off, emotional themes. These artists are going to become obsessed with emotions. I mean, look at this painting up here by an artist that we'll look at in a moment named Caravaggio. The scene is simple enough. It's a bunch of musicians who are clearly getting ready for a show or a song they're going to play. And there's this dude, right? All he is doing is tuning his lute. He is just tuning his instrument. And this dude is already starting to shed a tear. He's so emotionally overcome by just the tuning of his lute. By the way, full disclosure here, I absolutely love the Baroque era art. I love everything about it. I love the ideology of it. I love the approach that these particular artists took to it. I love how these artists took their own personal emotions and sort of bled it into their art. And I appreciate, don't get me wrong, I really do appreciate the mathematical, scientific nature of the High and Late Renaissance, and how they were trying to take art and sort of elevate it into something worthy of liberal art pursuit. But dude, there's just something about when you get to the Baroque, and there's this artwork that's just so willing to embrace that we as human beings are emotional creatures that I absolutely love. And so if during this lecture I get a little worked up, understand it comes from that I absolutely love this stuff, and that's why I'm getting as excited as I am. Hopefully that'll be infectious. We'll see. Another thing that we're going to see is a sense of drama, right? The scenes that will be painted will rarely be emotionless faces passively participating in whatever the story is. Instead, there is this sense of drama, that big things are happening. Look at the drama, if you will, of the scene below it here by an artist that we'll look at by the name of Rembrandt. Right? Drama, action. That's the kind of thing that you're going to see. There's tenebrism, or dramatic lighting, and even some of the sculptors of the time would get this tenebrism in. We'll look at what tenebrism actually looks like in a bit, but it's happening in both of these paintings. The short version is, it is this, like it says, a dramatic lighting that often has the figures looking like they're sort of emerging out of darkness. Then realism. Now, understand that this word realism is a very different thing from the naturalism that we talked about in the Renaissance, right? Realism is specifically about portraying, in the Baroque era case at least, is about portraying people and the world around them without idealization. Again, you'll recall, in the high and late Renaissance, that's what, especially in Italy, they were all about. Right? It was like taking people and trying to perfect them, either by applying the old Greek mathematics to the human body, or just by like prettying people up, making them seem more godlike. Because these artists are coming a generation after them and sort of see that as the old news, they say, screw that noise. We're interested instead in portraying people how they look, warts, skin diseases and all. If someone's skin is slightly yellowed because of jaundice, paint them like that. If their hair isn't perfectly in place, that's okay, paint it like that. If their bodies aren't perfectly proportioned the way that the ancient Greeks decided the human body should be proportioned, who cares, right? Display them the way that they look. And the stuff that surrounds them shouldn't be idealized either. So again, ordinary people, they love to have the blood, sweat, and tears of what it is to be human. That comes from that sense of drama and the emotional themes as well. And man, flesh. The Baroque era artists become obsessed with portraying skin and all the different ways that skin can be luminous, that skin can be rough, that skin can be diseased. But in a lot of cases, flesh is shown in a way that is meant to be sensual, right? That skin is sort of seen as this sensual thing, not always necessarily sexual, but certainly sensual. Like in this image here, again by Caravaggio. Now earlier I talked about the dude who's crying, even just tuning his lute, but don't think for a moment that I'm not also aware that there sure is a lot of skin on display here, right? It's almost as if we've like walked in on these gentlemen, these young men accidentally, and we kind of feel like we've stepped in on something that we shouldn't have, even though all that's happening here, they're practicing and getting ready. We sort of feel like we walked in and like, whoa, okay, excuse me, sorry, I don't know what's happening in here, but I'm going to back out and mind my own business. I'm sorry to have disturbed you, right? Because all that skin and all that flesh is given this sensuous nature that sort of permeates the entire image. Another characteristic that we see is storytelling by combining art, that is painting and sculpture, with stagecraft. In the case of paintings, the paintings often look like a scene is happening from a play. They're often set up with the same kind of thinking that one would give to a theatrical performance of where should people be placed, where should they be looking to guide our own eyes and take us around, and like how should it be lit in such a way as to create dramatic emphasis. In sculpture, oftentimes in sculpture, the statue will be set up in such a way as to look like it is on a stage. We'll look at an example of that, in fact. We'll start our exploration of Baroque art by looking at the Baroque in Italy. We'll look at three particular artists from Italy: Caravaggio, Giotteleschi, and Bernini. We'll start with Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio. And if you can't remember all of that name, don't worry. Caravaggio is just fine. There's only one. He was born in 1571 and died in 1610. And you might note by looking at that he only barely slips into the period that we are calling the Baroque. Caravaggio is the innovator that's going to get it all started. Caravaggio arrives on the scene, and suddenly all the painters out there want to paint like him. So what made Caravaggio different than the high Renaissance artists? Caravaggio looks at those artists that have come just before him, because he's right there on the tail end, and rejects everything about them. The late Renaissance, high Renaissance, late Renaissance artists, as we've already kind of talked about a little bit, did a ton of preparatory drawing before ever painting anything, right? Caravaggio didn't draw at all. He could not stand, he was impatient, could not stand the idea of having to spend a bunch of time doing a bunch of drawing. Why? When he can just get a bunch of models, put them in a room, and just start painting. He'd just start putting paint directly on the canvas. Bam! No underdrawing even. Right? No underdrawing, no preparatory drawings, just bam! We just dive in using his observation of his models. In a similar vibe, he was also anti-idealization of people. In fact, he liked ordinary, everyday people who didn't look perfect. He would often go, most of his career he was in Rome, and he would just go out onto the streets of Rome and say, "Hey, you, dude coming out of the bar," or, "Hey, you, beggar on the street," right? Whoever. Like, I want you, the grungy, dirty people of this city who are often ignored. I'm going to bring you in. Come with me, and I am going to take this scene, because, again, he's working for the Catholic Church. I'm going to take this scene that in the past has always been painted where the human beings are idealized and perfected and what have you, and I'm going to take you dirty, red-nosed dude from the tavern, and stick you right in the middle of that scene, because that's how I see my religion. Right? That's Caravaggio's thinking. And again, he arrives on the scene. He's making these kinds of paintings that seem to be connecting religion to the regular, everyday people of the world, ordinary, everyday people. The Catholic Church sees that, and they're like, "Hell yeah, dude. You're our dude now. You are our man." And he is brought into the fold, and he has commission after commission after commission from the Catholic Church. But Caravaggio is a problematic figure, which also makes him a fun figure, because even though he's an absolute darling of the Catholic Church, one of my favorite quotes about him is that we know way more about Caravaggio when we look back at history from his criminal record than from any other records that are written down about him. Because Caravaggio was just a troublemaker who could not stop getting himself into trouble. He was often getting arrested because even though he was not supposed to be carrying a sword around in public, it would have been not unlike carrying a gun on your hip without, in a place that doesn't have like an open carry laws. And he was always walking around with a sword. That was constantly getting him arrested. He was often getting into bar fights. He was often sleeping around with any woman that he could, and often found himself having slept with the wrong man's wife, who was then demanding retribution from him. as I say, often get into lots of fights. He was a total dude bro in a certain way, because he had his posse that would always follow him around and would always have his back whenever he would get into one of these fights. But because the church loved the work that he was doing for them, they found ways to make it right. They were like, okay, all right, Caravaggio, just stop, dude. Okay, come on back. We'll work it out. We'll smooth it out with the dude whose wife you slept with. Say 27 Hail Marys, and fine. Continue to paint for us. And so, because he was this darling of the Catholic Church, he was constantly getting away with a lot of that stuff. And so he saw himself as a sinner constantly struggling with his demons, but who was also passionately devoted to his faith. Tenebrism was that term that I came up with earlier, and he was the innovator of this that then all artists after him were emulating him. Tenebrism is a term for this dramatic lighting where the figures are painted in such a way as if they were lit by a spotlight that's off in some direction, and are given the appearance of emerging out of darkness, as if the modeling of that light isn't getting to those deep dark depths behind them. A lot of Caravaggio's paintings just have this pure black background, and a lot of artists would end up emulating that after him. And as you can see, the lighting on all of the figures here has them where portions of the person are cloaked in darkness, and other portions are sort of emerging out of it, almost like they were made out of that darkness, and they were just like sort of emerging out of it. He sees that as being a way of producing something that has drama and an emotional impact. And this painting here, his painting, The Calling of St. Matthew, sometimes it's referred to as The Calling of St. Levi. In the Bible, Matthew gets referred to as both Matthew and Levi, depending on which of the Gospels you're reading. This is The Calling of St. Matthew that he painted between 1597 and 1601. Again, you see that's extremely early. He's the innovator of the Baroque style. And I kid you not, people are going to start painting like him. Everybody wants to copy this after he sort of brings this style to the forefront. Now, this painting right here is emblematic of everything Caravaggio. He was paid, he had been commissioned to paint a series of murals in this particular chapel, I want to say. And he was stuck and was struggling. By the way, 1597, he's still in his 20s as he's working on this. And he was stuck. He was working on the piece that is directly opposite of this one, which I can't remember what it is now. And I was just struggling to find the inspiration because, again, Caravaggio he's about human emotions, so he was all about, you paint when you're inspired to paint. He was that kind. And was just struggling, couldn't figure it out. So he turns around and gives his attention to the painting on the other wall, which he instantly connected with. The story of the calling of St. Matthew. St. Matthew in the Gospels is a tax collector, and as such would have been considered the lowest of the low in terms of sinners in ancient Palestine, where Jesus was preaching. And the biblical story has Jesus showing up, seeing Matthew, and being like, you, Matthew, you're now going to follow me. That instantly clicks with Caravaggio, who sees himself as that sinner that God has smiled upon and has chosen him. So what does he do? How does he present this scene? Well, he doesn't have it set in ancient Palestine. Look at the way people are dressed here. This is, late 16th century, early 17th century Rome. The people are dressed the way people would have been dressed in Rome at the time. And it's very believable to think that he probably went out into the street, looked around for people to play the particular parts that he wanted them to play, brought them in and painted them exactly how they looked. Warts and all, not trying to idealize them. And he gives us a scene where Matthew, right here, right, drama. the dramatic lighting. The light is coming from this source up. Probably the way you're seeing it, I should be over here from the upper left, and then down into the rest of the painting, lighting upon Matthew and giving him the strongest light. It looks like something that's been set up on a stage, right? And Jesus has walked in and is pointing directly to him, like, you. And Matthew himself even seems surprised, like, me? No, you can't mean me. I'm this sinner. And where has he decided to set all of this? Well, you see St. Matthew here being surrounded by some other individuals, again, who have all been painted like regular everyday people. These younger boys over here. There's this dude over here, this kind of old wrinkle. There's this guy who's drunk and looks like he's probably about to pass out. And they are all sitting in a tavern, a bar, and they're sitting around a table and gambling. That kind of thing just wouldn't have been brought into a painting of the high or late Renaissance unless it was meant to be showcased as evil and wrong, right? But that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case here. It's just that Jesus has walked in. Jesus, by the way, also was probably some guy that Caravaggio got off of the street, because he's not presented in the way that we expect to see Jesus normally, in the way that he is painted in the Western tradition. And he has come in and has just pointed out this one guy who's participating in an act that we would expect Christ to be judgmental of, and he's not. He's like, you, I have chosen you. You are going to follow me. And again, that kind of thing clicked with Caravaggio, and this painting just flew out of him. He was able to put this down very quickly, and it is one of the earliest things that makes his name. This painting comes along, and suddenly Caravaggio is on the map. He's getting all of these commissions to the Catholic Church. He is the darling child of the Catholic Church. But then, sadly, a few years down the line, he goes too far. Again, Caravaggio could not stop involving himself in trouble, and he got into a bar fight again. And in this particular bar fight, it became heated, and again, he wasn't supposed to have that sword at his hip, but he had it, and he pulled it out during this fight and ended up killing the man with whom he was having the confrontation. And so this became a problem. And so suddenly the Catholic Church and all of these cardinals that have been protecting him and helping him to during these times when he's getting himself into trouble are like, dude, Caravaggio, look, man, we can't help you now. Look, you did the one thing you don't do. You don't kill a man. There's nothing we can do about that. We can't convince anybody that everything's okay now. We can't just have you say a few Hail Marys. You've killed a dude. We cannot fix this. So Caravaggio runs for his life, gets out of Rome, gets away, and sort of lives in exile for a while. There's this painting right here. David with the head of Goliath, painted in either 1609 or 1610. And this painting is, if not the last painting that Caravaggio ever did, it is one of the last paintings. And he did this while in exile because of his murder. And he makes this painting and he sends it back to Rome. David with the head of Goliath. Why would he do something like that? Well, first off, let's just talk about how it fits with the characteristics of the Baroque era. There is that extreme tenebrism. This character is emerging out of the darkness. It is an emotional scene. He hasn't chosen the moment where the fight was happening between David and Goliath, the story from the Bible. He's portrayed the moment after Goliath has already been killed and has been defeated, and David has cut off the head of Goliath to show it off. And David looks disheveled. He looks like someone who's truly been in a fight. But also, there's that sensuous nature of the skin. We are supposed to be ever so slightly titillated by all that skin. And again, he's holding up Goliath's head, and there's like I said, blood, sweat, and tears. Like I said, David himself looks sweaty and exhausted. The fingers of that hand, there's like the blood that's like caked under the fingernails. Goliath's head himself hangs there dead and limp, no life in it. And you can even see the blood just streaming from the neck where it was cut off. It's a very bloody painting. The interesting thing, however, is that this head of Goliath, this is a self-portrait. Why would Caravaggio paint himself as the defeated enemy of God and God's people? Well, it's believed this painting, again painted and sent back to Rome, was meant as his prayer of forgiveness. That this was sent back and it was like, mea culpa, I have done wrong, and this is the fate that I deserve. And I have sort of symbolically decapitated myself to show how worthless of a human being I am. Please forgive me. Sends us back, and all the cardinals who had been working with him look at this and they're like, damn it, Caravaggio. Damn, you're good. God, okay, all right, yeah, no, all right, fine. Yeah, okay, all right, cool. Come on back to Rome. We'll figure it out. We'll figure out some way to smooth this over. We'll figure out some sort of punishment that you can deal with, but you won't have to die from it. Come back and paint for us. You're just too damn good, Caravaggio. And then sadly, Caravaggio gets that news and is excited and is on his way back to Rome, and he becomes sick on the way and dies of his illness and never makes it back to Rome to paint anymore, dying at an extremely young age, and who knows what he could have accomplished had he lived longer in his life. But that emotional, dramatic life that he lived, and his insistence on painting everyday human beings the way they look and showcasing them, was like this the perfect match of a man who felt that strongly about those things and a church, the Catholic Church, who was looking for exactly that kind of thing. These two come and they have their very emotional and very distraught and fraught relationship together. And that's just the beginning of the Baroque. The Baroque era is going to follow that pattern. And we'll take a look at that as we move into part 2 of this discussion in the next lecture.